So let's go through a little bit of data first, just to set the context. So we, HFS, recently in conjunction with KPMG, we just did a pretty sizable study around the world covering a variety of industries and about almost 600 business leaders, including 100 C-level executives. And so right from the top, sort of in line with what I had mentioned, which is always really wanting to make sure we understand why. Why is any enterprise embarking on or contemplating the embracing intelligent automation? And what we've really found is that there's some pretty lofty objectives for the why. I think maybe a few years back when RPA was starting to really, we joke and say when enterprises were starting to understand what RPA stood for, there was a lot of hype around being able to replace people, drive a lot of cost savings. I think that that's really shifted now. What this data shows us is that we'll see strategic objectives on the left. The number one strategic objective for intelligent automation is to drive revenue growth. When we talk a bit about what the operational objectives are, it's very much focused on elements of customer experience, improving customer service, as well as streamlining interaction points. I think the real headline here, aside from what the strategic and operational focus areas are, is what's at the very bottom. Eliminate headcount, as you see, is dead last, literally less than 1%. So there's some, in terms of the why, what's in it for enterprises to be embracing intelligent automation, we've got some pretty lofty objectives. So let's talk a bit about the what, if you will. And this brings us to, from a technology perspective, what are some of the tools that are actually being adopted and how is this going? So there's a lot going on here, so I'll break it down into a few buckets, which firstly, if we look at all of the different technologies we've included here, this is a very broad swath of what at HFS we term intelligent automation tool sets. So I think one of the first takeaways is that enterprises are investing across a lot of different tool sets. So that's point one. And I think just that only, less than a third of enterprises are really either unsure or have no plans. So really there's just a massive uptake and a massive push for adoption across intelligent automation. But within that though, we look at piloting right now versus moving to production versus scaled up and industrialized. A lot of enterprises are really just getting started with this journey. It's quite piecemeal, if you will, and if I draw your attention to this component here about the relative percentages of enterprises that are scaled up and industrialized, it's quite low. I know if you average this out, it ends up to be about 17% of enterprises really would state that they feel scaled up and industrialized with their intelligent automation journey. And the other thing I'd point out here is that when you look at the bottom of the screen, I did call out the specifics for RPA. RPA is arguably been, we tend to call it the, affectionately, the gateway drug, but it's where a lot of enterprises have started their automation journey. But it's actually got some of the lowest hit rate for being scaled up and industrialized. Which brings us to the bit of the, why is this the case? We know a lot of these technologies are quite nascent, but really what are some of the inhibitors that are getting in the way of enterprises achieving their success? And so what we find somewhat fascinating is what comes out at the top, is that scale is actually what enterprises are citing as their biggest inhibitor to achieving both their strategic and operational goals. We find this interesting because scale in many ways is the scale and inability to achieve it. It's honestly more of an effect than a cause or an actual inhibitor. But we obviously have to take that into account, that this is what enterprises are going through at this point. They're really challenged to achieve scale. We just saw it in that prior slide. I will draw your attention to a couple of these other areas that I think start to get at more of the causes. Some of this uncertainty about what level of financial investment is needed, challenges around the organizational elements, who's leading this, if you will, or if we go down here and we see for these items that there are 1, 2, 3 rank, some of the ones that had very strong showing for a number 1 rank, We have that lack of in-house talent. That's a major issue, particularly for these new change agent technologies. It's just a time game. You have to build up the capabilities, as well as deficiency in overall data quality. This is sort of motherhood and apple pie, but it's very, very real, particularly if you're talking about having the appropriate data to train your algorithms. So there are a variety of challenges out there today that are inhibiting scale.